that you all can hear me, and I'm very glad that
Yes.
I can be here today. I won't talk Russian because I'm learning Spanish at the moment, and everything is mixed up in my head, but I can still understand everything. So if you have questions, you can, and you feel more comfortable in, or in Spanish, you can ask me. But I will share the screen in a minute, but I also prepared a handout because I did this last time when I gave a remote talk, last year actually, because when I couldn't come. And it was always nice for me because I can later turn that into a paper or something, and maybe some other. So I will share the link in the chat now. And I hope that this link works. And this is a draft paper. I wrote it on Monday, but the thoughts were in my head already a long time ago. And I will just now really try to share my screen. I think I have all the rights to do so. So you can see something empty. You can also see the paper online.
Yes.
And my slides are in this form. What I need to tell you also before I start with this whole presentation, what is important in this context is I don't offer any solutions today. I won't offer any solutions on the question of how to assess relatedness between languages, but I want to maybe switch a little bit from what we have been seeing in the past, either the fundamental camps who say like languages are related or not, and long-range reconstruction should be put on the garbage, or it's like possible, all the fights between the long ranges and the traditional people who are satisfied that Indo-European is just enough. This and the other, and then there's the other camp of people who say, I have a probability, I have a new algorithm, and this algorithm can prove everything. We don't need the humans anymore to assess something. And I want to bring in some concepts from psychology, social sciences, some ideas from test theory, from the idea how we do tests, and they're also in some sense also related to the current times, because if you think of tests, then you should also think of the tests for COVID-19, where lots of discussions have been also in the past, whether if you increase testing, you will have more cases, etc. All the discussions, they are really important, in fact, and they are somehow related because the same question of false positives or negative applies here as well. So let me just present this to you, and I'm really interested in the reactions because I don't offer mathematics, I don't offer an analysis of anything mathematical, but I want to try more to really concentrate on the obvious, in my opinion, also sometimes problems with the tests for relatedness that have been proposed in the past, but also with the whole situation. So the philosophical difficulty of assessing language relatedness. So this is my agenda for now. I want to give you some initial thoughts on tests and proofs, which I think are fundamentally different. I want to show how to design tests for relatedness. I want to discuss this so that we really have something common before we do this, before we go out and try to design tests. And I want to review some tests in the literature and give some opinions. That this is not to blame, but just to show where the problems are and how we can improve them in the future. So just to start with everything, we have a problem in linguistics, a problem that we don't have in biology. In biology, we believe in monophily, and we believe that all life has turned into existence once, going back to the last common ancestor of all. So I'm related to an ant, I'm related to a butterfly, and one could compare my genes with the genes of a butterfly and maybe find something there. So it's not the problem. However, in linguistics, we have the problem of that we do not even know whether language was evolved at the same time. And we know with respect to sign languages, for example, that obviously these have been sometimes created. So there is not a monophily as the basic assumption of this. And if you go back to the statute of the Société de Linguistique de Paris in 1866, they even wrote this in their statutes of their journal. So they wrote, la société n'admet aucune communication concernant soit l'origine du langage, soit la création d'une langue universelle. So the society does not accept any kind of informal communication, neither on the origin of language, nor on the creation of a universal language. So I said, like, let's not discuss language origin. But what biologists often don't understand is this is crucial. This means we need to prove that languages are related before we compare them. I cannot compare Chinese and German, all of the sub. Yeah. So since we do, this is like we have the burden of proof. We don't have this in other subjects. In biology, it's the assessment, is an ant more closely related to a human than a butterfly, maybe? Or is a butterfly more closely related to the ant? But they don't have the burden of proof that we actually need to justify why we compare two languages with each other. But where is the proof? Scholars themselves seem to have quite different opinions on those shared traits among languages that would count as evidence for relatedness. I think you would all agree with that people are really, there's this discussion, specifically this discussion that is reflected in a debate about grammar as proof on the one hand and lexicon as proof on the other hand, although this reduction is in fact highly misleading. I think we all agree on that. And George, and there is this paper also, you have been writing on this in the past. In my handout, I have given some literature where this is like really clearly shown. We always use forms, the form part of the linguistic science. So anybody who says it is just structure and grammar is misleading, because we will go back to sound correspondences, I think. And I think we should agree on that this is something that we need in order to prove language relatedness. Passing tests. In order to circumvent the problem, scholars have repeatedly tried to produce statistical tests that would help them to prove language relationship in a more objective manner. So the idea is linguists are maybe not objective enough, so we should do this automatically based on some or rigorously, formally, etc. The basic idea is that to show that it is highly unlikely that a certain similarity pattern as it can be observed between two or more languages has evolved by chance. So I think it's more or less like there are older sources for that, but it started with Rinch, who just made this popular by providing some tests that were later criticized by Baxter because they had like flawed mathematics in there, etc. But since then, people have been working along this direction. Now we come to the initial thoughts on tests and proofs. Absolute proofs and relatives tests. It's really important to understand that in classical historical linguistics, we treat genetic relationship in a manner similar to mathematicians who use proofs to mark a problem as solved. That is my claim, my first claim to be discussed also. I would say it was, you can see this in the literature. When the literature writes about the detection of Indo-European, of the relatedness of Sanskrit and Greek, etc., then the people say they detected it. It is not something that you just use a method in order so they didn't say like, let's test it or something, so that they detected the relatedness. And this is similar to what you do in proofs in mathematics. So there's a problem, you want to solve it, and maybe the problem doesn't have a solution. Yeah, the question is, and then somebody says like, I found a solution, and the solution is here. And this is one of the proofs. Maybe there are different proofs for the problem, but this is one proof. It's absolute, it's not relative. This is something that people don't understand, I think, or this is what leads to the confusion, because classical historical linguists want to think in these mathematical terms. And we know that there's also some idea that like sound laws of the whole terminology. Yeah, we think about this as proof. Now, the relativity, like the tests are relative. Yeah, the idea of designing a test is fundamentally different in this regard. Designing a test to prove something is therefore an enterprise which is problematic already. I would say it's not fitting. The idea of testing, the idea of finding a proof are fundamentally different. Because tests are approximations to problems, and they are always accompanied by rates of false positives and false negatives. So similar to you can have tests that are almost 100%, but you already see that during the COVID times that there are two tests. There are the short test in short time, done in short time with antibodies, and there are the tests that are really proving that you have it in your blood. But even after 1 week or 2 weeks, maybe it's already disappeared, so they cannot really prove anything, and then you have the false positivity rates. But in these cases, actually, it's the people accept certain things only when they are really close to something like 100%. There is nothing like 70%, and I accept that. But tests by nature have this aspect, yeah, that they say like there's a probability, and linguists have a hard time in actually going this way, that they would accept. I say it is 70% that the Altaic language family is a real language family, and the languages are related. And there's a 30% of uncertainty or certain things like that. People don't want to accept, they want to have the proof. Now I want to point you to construct validity and test theory, because I think it is important to keep this in mind, it's an important concept, a useful concept from the social sciences. A construct in the social sciences refers to something that is not directly observable, but they may leave traces in tests. While psychologists tend to believe that the concept of intelligence is real, I think maybe all of us would agree that there are intelligent people, or there's intelligence is a property of people, and it comes in degrees. Yeah, they agree that they cannot really investigate it. We agree that we cannot completely directly investigate it, and what we can do is the construct of intelligence. So we can say, like, intelligence surfaces by the fact that somebody does good in math tests, for example, or in other tasks. So we only see the result, we don't see the action itself. We cannot see intelligence and grasp it. Constructs can be defined in different ways, and some constructs of intelligence will perform better than others. For example, an intelligence test is a way to measure one construct of intelligence. And often people have said that this is culturally biased, since if you bring the intelligence test to other cultures and it presumes that you need to be able to read, or read even in an alphabetic languages, it doesn't make sense anymore. Yeah. So this is something where you can also criticize a construct and say, like, the construct you are measuring does not come close enough to the intelligence that we are actually interested in. Why is construct thinking important here? Because it can help to channel discussions about the nature of the proto-language. And this again is related to the idea of relatedness. And this again is important for testing things. We can treat the proto-language, which we can infer as a construct, or we know that this construct is not equivalent with the proto-language as it was once spoken. This is something that people also sometimes really, at least in the literature, is reflected. People say our reconstructions are not realistic, or they are only abstract, or people say, like, we can come close to that we would be able to speak Indo-European or something like that. I think it's just we assess in our reconstructions the construct of Indo-European. We would all agree that Indo-European existed once as a language, as we know it in some sense, but we would also all agree that our knowledge about the Indo-European is actually the construct, is something that is not directly accessible, because this is a past thing. Yeah, it's res geste, as you would say in Latin about the historical aspect here. Now, in scientific testing, if you want to measure the construct validity, that means how valid your test is, in which you want to assess something like intelligence, for example. You want to know how good is this intelligence test and why is it better than another one. You have these so-called control criteria for scientific testing. First, there is construct validity, describes how well each item of a test measures or predicts what it's supposed to measure or predict. So do I actually do what I want to do? So if I have people count from 1 to 100 as fast as they can, do I measure intelligence with that? Maybe not. Maybe, yeah, obviously not. So this is really bad, it's not valid. Then there's a question of reliability, describes a particular observation has yielded a replicable score. This means in some sense that you can actually apply it in other cases as well. So my counting test to see how fast people can count is still reliable, because I can just ask them maybe many different people to count, and I will find that there are differences among the people, but it's not that, well, or maybe let's go to the objectivity, but anyway, a reliability means that you can apply the test to many different aspects, and I will show what I mean in relation to tests for language relatedness, what this means for me. Then objectivity kennzeichnet die Unabhängigkeit seines Ergebnisses von der Person, die den Test durchführt, refers to the independence of the result from the person conducting the test, and this is really important, because often in linguistics we say that one person looks at the data and they find structures, and other people say, I don't find the structure that you find there. So this kind of aspect. So tests should be independent of the persons conducting them. But you can also see, I hope, that this is fundamentally different from a proof in mathematics. Just to repeat that, because if you say I have a test, the test should be independent of a person. In mathematics, the proof is often something that only one person can find, and this person is then called a genius. And this genius is the person that had the eyes to see the link, how to make the connection. Yeah, this is fundamentally different. A test is not that. I think it's completely. We should really make a strict separation between the two aspects. So, given that scholars often treat the proof of genetic relatedness as a specific test, the general control criteria developed in test theory of the social sciences should also apply to them. I think. Reliable, objective, and valid. As a result, we can use the notion of constructs and construct validity and try to assess the quality of proposed tests. Furthermore, when working on tests for genetic relationships in the future, it will be helpful to keep these basic criteria in mind. So how to design a test for relatedness then? How can we make sure that our tests are objective? So I will just follow the three control criteria. In historical linguistics, we look at a long history of celebrated individual scholarship that use intuition to solve the greatest linguistic riddles. In this respect, we share some tradition of the field of mathematics, as I said already, and the idea that proofs are detected and not inferred by an automated test. But tests should work without geniuses applying them, and they cannot rely on the intuition of a person. We may, of course, say that you need a certain expertise. In COVID tests, I don't want to overstrain the analogy, but you also would say that an experienced doctor should put the thing in your throat and get it out in order to test whether you have it, because we know that this is one reason for error, for erroneous results, because the people have not done it deep enough, or things. I read this at least in the literature. I'm not an expert here. But how do we guarantee objectivity in our tests? We can automate our test procedure to such a degree that you no longer need any person conducting the test. So we formalize the approach completely. However, this is not always possible, because there are certain situations where we still need manual labor. For example, creating a word list and then deciding deciding, for example, what translation to use for a certain language, for a certain concept. This is not trivial, and there are no ways to have a machine do this at the moment. So in these cases, we can ask several colleagues to conduct the same test and see to which degree they converge in their assessments. That is, we need to check the inter-annotator agreement. And this has rarely been done in historical linguistics, but I think it would be important to do so. What they do it regularly in some annotation tasks, and when they want to prepare data for machine learning approaches, or in other parts, at least they claim that they can do it. An inter-annotator agreement plays an important role in some parts of science, also in linguistics to some degree, but not in historical linguistics so far. Reliability is also a problem, since there are many different situations which may be different when reapplying a test. It's not easy to give a clear-cut assessment on how to assess the reliability of a given test completely. Oh, I have the same sentence here twice, sorry for preparing. Now, tests should be applicable to a coherent set of languages. Tests should state clearly the time depth until when they are expected to yield reliable results. Tests should be accompanied by a complete evaluation of their usefulness on cross-linguistic gold standards. This is very important, because people often underestimate the importance of really testing, trying to assess the error margin or the error rate of a test when they design something new. And this has not been done in many parts in the literature. So what we really know, we need to say, this test is applicable for the following coherent set of languages, maybe ideally all spoken languages. Often we forget that there are signed languages as well. Obviously, when doing historical linguistics in this part, we only talk about spoken languages because we have almost no idea how sign languages evolve and whether there's something similar to regular sound change in sign languages. I've been discussing this with sign language linguists in the past, and I find it very fascinating to think about that. Maybe there is no counterpart. It's only applying to spoken languages. Now, if I design a test, for example, the tests that Johanna Nichols proposed in 1996 in a book, where she said that you need this individual identifying evidence in order to say that languages are related. So she builds on the work by Meillet and translates many passages. So it's generally a very nice paper, I think, by her. But what she says is that only this counts. You need to find these cases that are so striking. This goes into the direction of proofs. This is not a good test. But if you say the only thing that I accept for language relatedness as a, let's say, is grammatical evidence in the grammar, this is not applicable to all languages. So it is not a useful test. And it would be similar to saying that I have this perfect test for COVID-19, but it only works on people with a body height of 170 centimeters. Yeah, it does not make sense to say that this is the only proof that I accept, because it would mean that people 170 centimeters and lower will be able to be tested, and all the people who are taller, not. And this is sometimes we should also think about what we want to achieve. Otherwise, on the other hand, I think it would be reasonable to say this test can only be carried out with languages, I don't know, maybe, but one should actually really say where it's applicable, because if it's not really completely applicable, then it has certain drawbacks, right? And we can just say, okay, we do not compare this test with another test and put them and say that, but it performs better on this small set of people. Gold standards are the most important part here that I think want to emphasize. Another last point is validity. It's even more difficult to guarantee, but if we keep in mind that validity means that the test measures what it is supposed to test, it is important to reflect about the major problems we have in identifying genetically related traits. And what are these problems? The different kinds of similarities. If we look at similarities in lexicon only, we have coincidental similarities like Greek theos and Spanish dios. We have non-coincidental similarities based on, for example, natural approaches like sound symbolism or similar or nursery words like Chinese mama and German mama. They are similar, but they are not related. We have the non-natural cases, which are the interesting for us. We have contact-induced lexical similarities, and we have genetic lexical similarities. Tooth and Zahn in English as an example, mountain, montagne as another example from for recent borrowing. So if we test and we cannot disentangle these similarities, our test is not valid. So we need to assess to which degree our test will test something, because if we test for relatedness, we only want to test for this part. And we know, everybody knows this in this virtual room, that we try too hard to really only go for this part, but we still have problems here, because if you just say like, I trust that my word list of 100 concepts, my 100 concept list is stable and resistant to borrowing, this is often not enough. And often if you can look at the discussions in the literature about somebody who claims I have found an idea how to prove relationship, then the people will just point to that and say, yeah, maybe it's early contact. So we need to work harder on that. We need to work harder on finding out how we can really exclude contact for maybe other reasons. And specifically also how to deal with the questions of sound symbolism, because I think they are often overlooked also in, when it comes to assessing a certain hypothesis for long range or for other, specifically, of course, because these are the most contested ones. So if we design a test for genetic relatedness, we need to make sure that we do not measure any other kind of relatedness. It is obvious that this is very difficult and have tried to circumvent the problem, as I just said. But we really need to find a way to operationalize it, to exclude it in our tests. Otherwise, it's also not really honest also to say that this test will prove, even if proving by testing is not possible, as I would claim almost. Now, let us review the tests in the literature, but only quickly. And there's no, the idea is really that we can improve this in the future, because I think generally I'm fond of tests for relatedness, but we should be clear about the fact, if I have a test for relatedness, this is not to be confused with the proof of the kind of German and English are related, or the kind of, or the Indo-European language family, and this where we have so much evidence already assembled. We should really distinguish the two. And maybe these tests should even only be used for long range, for the parts where we are come to a point where we do not have enough evidence to see whether we find some hints there. And we should accept also that we say our tests may have a certain error rate. So, and we should try to assess this. So what is a good test? The test should either be fully automated, or otherwise it should come along with extensive tests on inter-annotator agreement. Hard to achieve, something that we really need to work on, but we can also do this in steps. One point, for example, is we need to look into the question how reliably we can construct a good concept list. So for a given language, a word list based on a list of concepts. So do we really find criteria that are so that different linguists will come up with the same solutions? So because it's really not trivial what word to choose as a translation for a given concept. For example, German concept to kill, translated into German, there are two words, umbringen and töten. And I have asked many people, I cannot tell you as a German even which word I use more often. So one is cognate with all the other words in Germanic, the other one is a neologism, is a new a word that was coined new. We don't, it's not clear. It's not clear for me where I distinguish, so I would actually then give two translations. Often, umbringen, the form that means to, is oh yeah, is not visible. So now we just, I don't have much time left. So first, regarding the correspondence-based approaches by Range, etc., who infers correspondence statistic from a semantically aligned word list, which were then later criticized. They have a rather simple workflow. You compile a word list for all the languages that you want to work on. You make a matrix of n sounds occurring as initials in language A and M sounds occurring, and then you make a cross table of the correspondence and you evaluate the results statistically. The problems is the procedure by which the words are compiled is not objective, as I said already. This is in most applies to all tests. The procedure less than assessment of its reliability is what only tested on a few languages so far, and validity is unclear as there is no explicit control for borrower links and sound symbolisms. The model of relatedness does not allow for semantic change, question we need to ask ourselves whether it's important or not, and restricting matches to initial sounds deprives the test of its power. I will skip this one. The other parts are the sound class-based approaches. Dolgopolsky's idea, then later used by Baxter, Manis-Terama, but also specifically used by the tests that the Moscow School of Historical Linguistics is using. So this approach by Turchin et al., where it is also presented, and then also in a recent paper by Kasyan et al., where sound classes, consonant classes are used in order to find potential cognates and then make a statistics to see as we can see here, whether it is significant to find as many cognates as there. I see similar problems in these cases, in the word list compilation, but also in the gold standard testing. I think we need more tests. So far, this has been not satisfying, specifically that they are open and we can use some code in order to repeat that. The control for borrowing is also something that is still unclear, etc. And I think the tests generally have the problem of low power because they do not find all the cognates, and this makes it difficult then actually to assess how much we could find. Now the outlook, and then I'm finished. My wish list for future methods that are based on open research paradigms with open data, open code, so that other people can reapply, newly apply, and build on them. Methods that are exhaustive, being tested on more data, not just on a couple of languages in which the scholars are interested. Specifically, the recent paper by Seolin in 2019, which says that I prove that Altaic does not exist, is wrong because it only uses Altaic languages. And if you use this test and do not test it on all the languages in the world as a counterexamples, you cannot prove it. You can only, because we do not know how good the test works. If we do not have an assessment how good the test works, we cannot disprove the relationship. And we need methods that are explicit on their limitations and provide exhaustive statistics on their success and failure on a gold standard. Otherwise, I wouldn't accept it. So I think this is what we really need in the future. I think it's enough. We need to distinguish testing and proving something. And this is what I hope for then. Scholars happen to compare the right traits and to find evidence as striking as a video proof conducting a murderer. Often scholars still think about relatedness in these absolute dimensions, not in relative dimensions. In the future, we need to advance in both directions. We need to strengthen our heuristics and we need to strengthen our tests. Спасибо.
Гоша, я боюсь, что у вас не включен микрофон. Мне кажется, говорите.
Да.
Thank you, Tatas. I think we have plenty of time for questions and discussions because we started a little early. So if I may, I'd like to ask the first two questions myself. The first question is, you were talking about this idea of construct. Basically that it would be more productive and efficient for us to define proto-languages as constructs and then apply the same rules to these constructs as implemented in social sciences. So I'm still not quite clear how this actually influences the pragmatics of our work. And so what should we actually change in our thinking and our method if we understand, yes, proto-language is a construct, and we should all remember that. And especially also in the light of the fact that I think that the same logic applies to language in general, right? Philosophically speaking, we could say that language, not just proto-language, but language itself is a construct, right? We don't really observe language as such. We observe parole, mais pas langue. So language is also a construct that we kind of deduce and infer from various observations, and nobody can really define what language is, but somehow we still work with language. So that's question number one, and I also have a second one, but perhaps it's better if you
okay.
tell us what you think about the first one.
Yeah, actually, this is you are. So in some sense, you are putting the finger in the wound, but in another sense, it's exactly what I wanted. Also, what I didn't tell, but what I should tell. The reason why I like the constructs, or what has happened in psychology, was, as I understand it, yeah. So I'm not an expert here, but my sister is a psychologist. I have many discussions with her. Is this psychologists barely discuss the problems that they have in, for example, intelligence. So they would not have the discussion, oh no, intelligence doesn't exist after, no, you cannot measure this, you should not do it, no, they just try to advance it. And I think in linguistics, we are stuck in discussions about whether it's possible after all. So this whole discussion about realism of linguistic reconstruction, I think it was just a waste of time in the past, because obviously we don't restore the full language. But obviously, the quality of how we can reconstruct depends on something that we can, in some sense, even measure. We can look at Latin and can test certain things, and we can then assess it and can say, okay, and sometimes we achieve a realistic, some degree of realism, at some point not. But I think this, putting it into this whole philosophy about about 1 and 0, yeah, so realism, abstractionism, was just a waste of time. If they had the concept of a construct, they wouldn't have done it. What you can see in psychology, it has been really productive for psychologists to just circumvent the problem of what we are actually dealing with there. So it's a trick. It's a trick to avoid having to answer these questions again and again. That's what I think, to be honest.
Okay, so basically this is just so that we can skip all the boring and harmful discussions of what proto-language actually is, and was there really such a proto-language or not?
Yeah, because, and I think we should also say, we all agree that Indo-European existed, yeah, unless we are really disbelievers, because we say like all the evidence, so it's an ontological reality, it existed once. But on the definitions on the details, we don't agree. Similar to psychologists who would say, yeah, we think intelligence exists in some sense, but how to measure it, we don't know, or we disagree here. And I think this is much more productive than having this. I mean, yeah, there are some people who don't believe in Indo-European, some people also don't believe in intelligence, right? But I think we can then, I think it's really just for channeling our discussions and, yeah, having a more, just concentrating on the interesting stuff. And I think you can see that in psychology. It's like the people really have a different approach there. And often we also think when we see psychological studies, how can they be so naive? I find it sometimes when they do the new study on like a couple of high school students in the Americas and try to abstract for the whole world. And you see this that these are the popular science news in psychology. But I think they can do these kind of things I think sometimes it's just good to have enough people to just dare to test something. In linguistics, often we even do not do it because we are afraid of doing something, right? Because of the critics of our colleagues, that how can you be so, and you cannot measure that, you cannot try something.
Okay, I get it, thank you. And my second question was, well, when you were talking about borrowings, how we should have more understandable and stricter criteria of how to separate borrowings from signs of borrowings from signs of genetic relatedness. This kind of triggers the consideration that a very important prerequisite of any successful test is that people who conduct the same tests kind of agree on the fundamental postulates that underlie these tests. So, for instance, we can't really make our tests, soundproof for borrowing unless before that we actually agree with other people on what constitutes borrowing and what constitutes relatedness. So, for instance, we have conducted some tests and we say, okay, look, there are more similarities in the core stable basic lexicon than there are in less stable cultural lexicon. So this is clearly a sign that this is a sign of genetic relatedness versus borrowing. But other people will say, why do you think that, right? How can you tell that core basic lexicon cannot be borrowed or something like that? Anything can be borrowed, right? There have been papers by Sagar, no limits to borrowing and stuff like that. So so that's one big problem. You set yourself rules, and you say, okay, my test follows these rules, and according to these rules, this is more indicative of contact-induced similarity, and this is more indicative of genetic relatedness. But other people will say, okay, we don't accept your rules, right? We think that anything can be borrowed. We think that grammar can be borrowed, lexicon can be borrowed, anything can be borrowed. I sometimes think that this is actually a more difficult problem even than designing the tests, to get people to agree on fundamental rules and postulates underlying the tests. What do you think?
I think you're right. That, but one could actually maybe say this a little bit differently, or I could try to draw a future in which this problem does not occur anymore. So my vision would be that we really conduct statistics where we would say, like, on the shallow language families also, so where we can control it more or less, and we really make assume that we have, like, for 1,000 languages, 2,000 languages, we have these concept list of 300 and more concepts, so that we have, like, both the cultural lexicon and like the basic vocabulary terms there, and we could really just have some accounts, and we could then actually and when Laurent Saga says that you can borrow everything, we would then tell him, yes, Laurent, you're right. There is one outlier language in our sample of 1,000 languages that we have investigated, but in most of the languages, the situation is exactly as you said in the rules, that it's predicted that when you have more stable, more cognates in the cultural, or when you have these, so if you have, like, more similarities only in the cultural lexicon than in the basic vocabulary, then this points to borrowing relations, and in the other case, it points to deeper relationship. So that means if we go for actually not, I think that is the basic, that is the gold standard that we need to have. And I think what is lacking is that people can get by giving one example that shows that it's possible, is first the lack of statistical thinking, right? Or the lack of, because outliers always happen. Of course, it is possible. And even in the bi case, we do not know whether bi is not related. I think the last word is not spoken yet, whether bi is not more closely related to the Semitic languages. I think maybe also the case. So first that, and like the fundamental difference between proof and testing, proving and testing things, and then having the gold standard data that would actually give us the evidence. And I think the burden of proof still we don't have enough, or I would like to see a study that shows that this claim that I think it also goes back to Jachantov, right? That if you have more in the basic part than in the cultural part, then that you can use this in order to discriminate between true relationship and relationship by borrowings, by language contact. So I think this needs to be done in the future. But if it's done, then we would have the assessments, and we could say, like, look, how we could also start talking about probabilities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I think we have a couple of remarks from Alexei Kasyan in the chat. Mattis, do you see these?
Yes.
I think that we probably all see the remarks about good test should stay. Well, okay. So can you answer these?
Yeah. So we start with the first. I start now with the. I start with Kasyan's, and then I will go to the other part so first, a good test should state time depth. State time depth. This works, but it seems impossible. Any formalized test deals with phonological similarities. Regular sound comparisons are not established yet because we are not sure about relatedness of the legs in question. But sound mutation operates with quite different rates, so universal time depth for a given test cannot be estimated. Well, I think that is easy to answer. What I want to say is, if we know that a test doesn't have much power, and we know obviously that Ringe's test doesn't have almost any power. So it was like he uses the first consonant, the first sound in the language, and looks for regularities there. And he could not even show that Armenian and English are related. Yeah, Baxter was showing that you could more or less show that there are some hints that English and Hindi are related, but there were also false positives involved in the test that he found there. But anyway, in a sense, like, you know, if you cannot even show that, by time depth, I do not mean time depth in saying 2,000 years, but I mean more or less like qualitative, maybe the assessment, George, that you had in one paper between A, B, and C languages, that we say like this works on dialects, but this would be trivial, right? I mean, dialects is something where we do not need to prove it, but we would say like it works up to the Indo-European level. And if we then show that the test even fails to work on Indo-European, why would I apply it to Altaic in order to say, look, like, I think this paper by Seolin is a good example. I think you, if you don't know, I can just, I will just quickly share my screen in order to show it.
Mattis, because such a test, the only answer that can be given by such a test is yes. The language in questions are probably related to each other, but such a test is not able to give us an answer. No relatedness.
Yes, exactly. You got me. You get me. That's what I say. That's exactly what I say. This whole, I think the whole paper, that this paper was accepted like as is. Yeah. First of all, also the data is really difficult to replicate the test. Also, I looked at the data because they use the orthography still. So I find it sometimes, I found it interesting that this paper was accepted and was not getting more, that it was really along these lines, because also some literature is not stated. So there are certain other papers also that were not. So I think, and then saying like, look, I don't find evidence for this. It's just, no, the test was not designed to find evidence against relatedness.
I guess I know this paper, and it uses a very, very dirty input data, and I don't see sense to discuss
Yeah, but we need to discuss the things. I say we need to discuss certain things because we need to improve the field. And if a paper appears in Diachronica, we need to also be able to also answer this, and also because there is another, I can tell you, because we are in a short circle, there's a paper forthcoming that proves that Basque is related to Indo-European. Now, guess who was writing this paper? But this paper was accepted by Diachronica, and it uses also certain methods, new methods on finding cognates and creating artificial languages. So very sophisticated. But again, it was only tested on 5. So it was tested like, let's compare Indo-European against Austronesian. And oh, wonder, we don't find evidence. But now let's compare Indo-European against Basque. Oh, we find some evidence. That's not how it should work. I think this is just really, then please give me 100 proto-languages and compare all of them. And then we say like of 100 proto-languages that we compared Indo-European with, Uralic is the closest. And then we'll say, yes, okay, that means it is maybe best idea to start with Uralic. Why should we start with Basque now? Yeah, like that's my major spirit. I think we are on the same page here. So it's not, I think it's more like I would actually conform, let's say like tests like this paper by like you cannot disprove in this way. This is a complete misunderstanding of what testing is. That's what I mean by time depth. Yeah, so we should be honest. So if it fails on Indo-European, don't use it to disprove Altaic. I mean, that is just, right? I think we all agree on that.
And then there's the second part.
Yeah, such a test should be close to modeling real comparative historical research, at least as far as criteria for eliciting possible etymological lexical. This is also a problem that we have, like modeling, and I think that is what I was criticizing as well. I don't like it when the people, these tests where you say, I take the first letter, and even letter, yeah, I don't like that. I feel we can do better than that, and this is so ridiculously, I don't understand why these tests have been designed in this way. And for example, in this case of consonant or consonant matching approach, this is actually something that has been tested where we can apply to many languages, and when we know that it is reliable in the sense of it is very conservative. So if we don't find evidence, it might still be there, might still be evidence, but if you find evidence, it should be really obvious. Yeah. So it's actually I like the test for that, for those properties. But in the case of just well, that is also something I completely agree. It's something like a qualitative criterion, or what I try to capture by saying like the modeling or the like these aspects. So I subscribe to this fully also. I don't have answers to all these questions, but I think it's something that we can use also as ammunition in order to discuss with people with tests that have been proposed in the future. I think by just saying like, look, if you don't test on 50 languages or on at least 100 languages, then don't tell me that you have proven something like that. And last point, because I think the time is also up now, even if I was talking a little bit longer than. What I find very important also in the whole discussion about these tests and the like is people often say these tests are by their nature, they say like, well, but by chance, I would expect that this never happens one time in 100,000 times. And that's why I have a significance of so and so and so and so. I think this is fundamentally wrong, because empirically, we do not know how many matches we find between languages all over the world because we haven't done this test. So how many chance resemblances do I find if I go for strict concept similarity, concept identity criteria? These are tests we need to do our homework. We need to carry that out. And people often say, I can shuffle, I can use a permutation test. I shuffle the word list and compare foot and hand. And this is doing it a trick. No, it is not. I want to see this being tested on a sample of at least 1,000 languages, I would say. Why so? From different continents, and see how many matches do we find between random sets there. And I would say, if I'm right, and we really do not control good enough for sound symbolism, because there are certain hidden things that point to that sound symbolism may even surface in a way that we do not think about it, yeah? Not just nursery words like mama. Then we would find similarities, chance similarities, and we would not be surprised by, say, like finding 3 or 5 matches in a 50 word list or 50 concept list or 100 concept lists. And if this is the case, we need to be careful with this. I think that's also something we should do in the future. I hope that we will be able to do that soon, because we are assembling lexical data coded in the sound cases that we can have an estimate on that.
Okay, thank you. A short historical remark. It seems to me that the idea of the first consonant was first introduced by Aaron Dolgopolsky in the 60s, and it was partly justified for him because it was dealing with the long-range comparison, Nostratic, Aphrasiatic, and we know that the second consonant and the third consonant are frequently get dropped and so on. So only the first consonant is most stable. But of course, you are right that the general idea that the only first consonant should be taken in account is wrong.
Okay, we've got another remark from Svetlana Boblak. Everything can be borrowed, but with different probability.
Yes, exactly. I think that is important. Yeah. So we really need to. The probabilities is something, but when we switch to probabilities, we should not start and say this is proven or disproven. We should not use these words. We should say it's highly likely and something like that. And I think also if we manage, for example, to get some global borrowing statistics, maybe it's not possible, yeah, because maybe they are family specific or area specific, because the people also use different artifacts there and have different kinds of lives, so they could also borrow different words, right? But if we have some assessment on that and can control it, then we could also say, like, these words are really rarely borrowed, so why should that happen? So I think it's, but once we enter the realm of probability, we should really clearly also remark that we are leaving the realm of classical mathematical. I say like this just because it's like a similar attitude. Yeah, we are no longer talking about this. I'm the genius who has the fabulous intuition, and I found the proof that the languages on this part of the world and this part of the world are related, something like that. Then there's really fundamentally different approaches.
Yes, well, from experience, I think we've all learned to distrust most of the recent papers claiming relationship between different languages, where the abstract says that we have established fundamental proof based on regular sound correspondences that, you know, Basque is related to Indo-European or something like that. So we all should beware of these statements, because they're usually are quite misleading.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mattis. I think we've run out of time now. So thank you a lot for a wonderful opening talk, and we hope to hear more from you next year as well. You know, we'll see how it goes. So